The swoop flew low over the ravaged landscape, hugging the shattered rooftops. Small tornadoes of dust and debris sprang up to mark its passage. The pilot did not notice the destruction, the rooftops or the dust. He had seen it all before. His eyes were riveted ahead, his hands gripped the sticks, and his mouth clenched tight. The swoop flew toward an eerie landscape of high-rise buildings, once a great metropolitan center. Now, after nearly 20 years of interplanetary warfare, they were empty shells. The swoop sped toward them. At the last instant, the pilot twisted the sticks to the side and worked the pedal controls. The swoop twisted and turned, snaked its way through the maze of twisted girders and blown-out windows. A blaster shot rang out, close, but the pilot continued his weaving course without hesitation. There were always snipers, but they only added to the excitement. Up ahead, the piece de resistance, the ultimate fly-through. The pilot's eyes narrowed, searching for the opening. There it was. The great doors, partially torn from their mountings, hung to the side like the wings of some tortured moth. Beyond, the cavernous interior, empty, dark, and dead. He angled downward, flattening his approach at the last minute, and blasted past the broken wings, through the great opening that only just accommodated the swoop. Into the building. He hadn't counted on the sudden change of illumination, the darkness. Blinded, he kept the swoop on a steady course. He had less than 2 seconds before he'd have to maneuver again. 1 and... too late. He'd have to begin his turn. He pulled hard against the counter-force of the sticks, jerking his swoop in an impossible loop. He'd rehearsed this in his mind so many times. He could do it. The G-forces slammed him against the seat, and the sticks jerked and tried to pull free, to follow the path of least resistance. But he kept his grip on the swoop, willing it around, imagining the walls and ceiling, feeling their presence in his mind. If he slammed into one of them... He could see again, but it hardly mattered now. The swoop was inverted, and he hung on with his knees, not trusting the safety belt. The swoop hit the ceiling of the cavernous room, not too hard, then bounced slightly with a scraping sound that echoed over the engine roar. There were bright sparks that died quickly, and great chunks of ceiling that fell in slow motion toward the floor below. The pilot held his breath and pushed forward on the sticks, then twisted hard to the side. The swoop steadied, twisted in the air, and was headed once again for the great doorway it had come through. He had done it. He had executed a near-perfect stunt. Far away, he knew, the collected voices of the audience would be gasping and yelling. He had only to make it through the doorway, and he was home free. Suddenly, a miscalculation, very slight, as the swoop edged through the great opening. Something was wrong with the stabilizer nozzles, probably damaged in the collision with the ceiling. The swoop hit the side of the entrance with a sickening crunch, careened sideways a moment, then began to spin. The pilot did not panic. By instinct, he corrected the spin and let the swoop slide sideways toward the wall of a nearby building. Then he accelerated, poured emergency power into the swoop's oversized engines, turning near disaster into a showy direction change. The swoop shot out between the buildings again and back over the ravaged rooftops of the dead city. Nobody watching it fly would have guessed the extent of the damage it had suffered. It held a steady course. As he approached the staging area for the swoop competition, the pilot saw the cycling lights ahead and knew they were being raided. The local authorities had better things to do, but they still cracked down on the illegal swoop rings at regular intervals. Instinct took over, and he sent the swoop into a fast dive and turn, wondering if anyone had even witnessed his stunt. Or were they all running, dodging, escaping, or worse, being loaded into the hover wagons and carted away to reclamation sites? And worst of all, he knew he would never collect his winnings. That stunt would certainly have pulled in a lot of cash. He pulled the sticks hard and headed away, hugging the deck to avoid being spotted. 3. The hangar. Back in the small hangar where he kept the swoop, Marek Stele surveyed the damage. Without the winnings from the stunt competition, he would have a hard time making repairs. He could pound out and straighten the hull easily enough, but a few servos and some adjusters had been flattened, and replacing them from the black market would be costly. There was a double knock on the hangar door. He recognized the cadence. It was a friend. Marek walked to the door, stepping carefully over several half-finished assemblies, peered through the peephole to confirm that it wasn't a trap, and spied Pargo offering a rude gesture toward the peeper. Laughing, Marek opened the door to let his friend inside. Though only an inch or two taller than Marek, Pargo must certainly have outweighed his friend by half again. Not fat. No, just naturally big and strong. Pargo could easily outmuscle anyone he met, any human anyway. He walked inside quickly, and Marek closed and latched the door behind him. "So, you got away," Marek offered by way of greeting. "Was out stunting, just like you," Pargo answered. Indeed, Pargo was still wearing long boots and coveralls, typical swoop gear. Marek scowled. "Waste of time," he said. "I would have won easy. I was powered." Pargo glanced at Marek's swoop. "Yeah, maybe, but at least my swoop's still in one piece." Marek said nothing. Pargo was right. Pargo pointed at the front of the swoop. "Hey, what's that?" Marek just shrugged. Pargo fingered a small device bristling with wires and gleaming connectors. He grinned and said, "One of your strange gadgets, I bet." "Just a modified gyro-servo sensor array I was testing." Pargo laughed. "Well, there's nothing to gyro-servo now. Why don't you flash down to the maze? I hear there's been some strangers nosing for info. We could maybe buzz on them, have a little fun." "Probably Bordali spies. To hell with them. To hell with all Bordal. For that matter, to hell with the whole war." "These guys might know something," suggested Pargo. "You know, about—" A fierce, almost feral look from Marek made Pargo hesitate. "So you coming?" he asked after a moment. The look evaporated, became something akin to resignation. "Yeah," Marek answered. "I'll meet you there. I gotta see my mum, bring her some stuff." Pargo left then, after arranging to meet Marek at the maze in 3 hours. After a last careful survey of the damaged swoop, which had not miraculously repaired itself, Marek showered, changed, secured the door, and walked off into the night. 4. The hidden room. An hour later, Marek was walking up a steep flight of stairs in a very lonely, very hidden part of the old city. Small creatures scuttled underfoot as he climbed, and he could sense the eyes peering through small holes in the walls. He never much liked it here. At the top of the stairs, he gave a complex knock. It was a code based on the date and some astrophysical calculations. Even someone who followed him and listened would not be able to duplicate that special knock. The door opened instantly, and Marek walked inside. The contrast between the dark, half-burned-out stairway and this room couldn't have been greater. The room was well lit, clean, and furnished with fine furniture. On the walls, old tapestries shared space with scientific hollows of stars of all kinds. Some of the hollows were covered with scribbles and indecipherable writing. Marek's mother stood near the door. She was a beautiful woman nearing 40. Her dark hair was pulled up and tied in a casual-looking knot held by a large clasp. She wore a simple, utilitarian beige tunic belted at the waist. Her feet were bare. "You always seem to know when I'm here," Marek commented, noticing how quickly his mother was at the door. "The walls have eyes," answered Marina Stele, "and the eyes have mouths." She was smiling, but after a moment the smile disappeared. "We need to talk." She turned and walked through a doorway into another room as well furnished as the first. Heavy curtains covered the windows, and behind the curtains, Marek knew, there was another covering to prevent any light at all from leaking out into the street. During the 20-year war, blackouts were standard on Cohen, but this room was sealed practically airtight.
"Sit down," she said. Marek sat. He chose a stiff, hard chair that seemed to fit the formality of his mother's tone of voice. He waited while she fixed some local Touraine tea in the adjoining kitchen. She took her time, carefully scraping the leaves, arranging them according to custom in the cup, then adding the water. He watched through the open doorway, but he did not get up and join her, nor offer to help. He knew his mother wanted him to wait, to sweat it out.
"You're on the hollows, you know," she said at last, placing his teacup on a small table to his right. Marek's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" he asked. "That stunt you pulled. The raid was broadcast, and your stunt was part of the coverage." She sat on a low chair facing him and began to blow on her tea. "Fireballs! That's beam!" he exclaimed, reverting to street talk. But Marina Stele only frowned. "They had your name," she began. "So, I always use your real name," she interrupted. Marek said nothing, but he understood. His real name was all too well known, and both he and his mother were prime borderline targets. It was one thing to be linked with illegal swoop gangs. That was a minor offense, and the local military authorities would do only a half-hearted job of pursuing a swoop criminal. "They had your name," she began. "So, I always use your real name," she interrupted. Marek said nothing, but he understood. His real name was all too well known, and both he and his mother were prime borderline targets. It was one thing to be linked with illegal swoop gangs. That was a minor offense, and the local military authorities would do only a half-hearted job of pursuing a swoop criminal. But to be related to the famous scientist, Kerek Stele, was something else altogether. Ever since his father's abduction by Bordali agents, he and his mother had been keeping low, though truth to tell, Marek took too many chances. But capturing Kerek's family would give the Bordali a powerful threat to hold over him. The Bordali would need something to make him cooperate. Ordinary methods would almost certainly not work. They sat talking for some time. Marek insisted that the publicity from the swoop episode would not cause them any problems. However, Marina disagreed and insisted it was time for both of them to move on, to find another place to hide. Marek was just about to tell her she was too cautious for maybe the 20th time, when there were several loud squeaks from the other room, and Marek's mother leapt to her feet. Too late. A blistering beam of energy hit the outside door just as Marek followed his mother into the room to investigate. The door glowed for a second, the metal core began to melt, then the whole thing vaporized. Behind it, partially obscured among the fumes and smoke, was a man dressed all in black. In his hand, the heavy blaster glowed. Quickly, before Marek had even grasped the situation, Marina was shooting. From somewhere, she had obtained a small 1- or 2-shot blaster, and already the man behind the door was falling backward. Marek noticed that his mother's hair was loose around her shoulders. "This way," Marina gasped, grabbing Marek's arm and dragging him toward the back of the apartment. Marek followed, feeling helpless and wishing he had a blaster too. His mother pulled him into a closet at the back of the building. It seemed a silly thing to do, but suddenly the floor of the closet gave way, and they dropped quickly and for some time. When they landed, Marina yelled, "Kick it!" and pointed to the wall. He could hear some commotion going on above them, and it didn't seem the time to argue with his mother, so Marek lifted his booted foot and pounded the wall with all his strength. A large section of the wall fell away, and he could see the dark alley beyond. They ran. 5. The Bordali. A low, patchy fog blew through the damp streets, and the only light came from 1 or 2 of Kwan's moons. They listened a moment to the sounds of yelling back inside the building. Out on the street it was quiet, and, without a word, Marina began running to the left, pulling Marek along behind her. Her bare feet made hardly a sound on the rough pavement, but Marek's boots were not so silent, and their slaps against the ground seemed each like small concussion missiles detonating in the alley. Marina rounded the next corner. Marek was a few strides behind, catching up quickly. He had no clear idea where she was heading, and so just followed without thought, his senses casting about behind, fearing pursuit. And so he nearly crashed into her as he came around the corner. She was standing rock still, and he was just able to slow his charging gait before he knocked her down. Then he too stopped short. There were 6 of them, all with blasters drawn, all dressed in black. The black shapes quickly fanned out around them. Marina threw her small blaster on the ground and held out her hands. Marek shouldered in front of his mother and stood ready to take on the whole lot of them, but Marina whispered, "Give it up, son. If you fight them, they will kill you and take me anyway. They won't kill us if we give up. They want us alive." "Listen to your mother, boy," one of their assailants said. Then he motioned with his blaster to the others, and 4 of them darted forward. They placed restraints on Marek's hands and a soundproof hood over his head. The world went dark and completely silent. His last clear image had been of his mother smiling his way, but looking rather sad, in fact, as 2 black figures bound her hands. He was seized, none too gently, and pushed forward. He stumbled at first, but soon grew used to the pace his captors set, 1 on each arm. After a few minutes, they slowed, then stopped, and waited for what seemed like hours, but was probably no more than 10 minutes. They led him up a ramp. He still couldn't see or hear, but he could feel the ridged walkway under his boots, and something told him he was entering a ship. Someone strapped him into a seat. There was the familiar pull of gravity as the ship accelerated and left the ground. Marek hungrily used his remaining senses to gain clues to the ship's direction, but the only clear sensation was up. After a while, the sense of planetary gravity and acceleration was replaced by an even pull, clearly an artificial gravity field. That could only mean they had left Kuan altogether and were in space. He could feel the slight vibration of the ship's engines. They were still under power. Someone removed his hood then, but not the restraints. He blinked in the sudden light, rubbing his eyes with his bound hands. As his vision cleared, he took in the scene around him. He was in a small cabin with no viewports. He could see a standard sliding hatch ahead of him. He couldn't see behind. The room was large enough to accommodate perhaps a dozen people, but there were only 6 seats. He guessed he was in some kind of shuttlecraft. His mother was strapped into one of the other seats across the room, her face set in a fierce expression. 2 guards with blasters stood at the hatchway. They wore light green Bordali military uniforms. One man in a black uniform stood nearby. He spoke. "I am Gwaj. I am an agent of the people of Bordal. I just want you to know that we have no particular use for either of you, other than to secure cooperation from your husband." He nodded toward Marina. "And your father." He looked directly into Marek's eyes. "Please understand, we need only one of you for that purpose. If you cause us any trouble, we will kill one and keep the other." Nobody said anything, so the man continued. He seemed to need to enjoy his triumph. Marek wanted to throttle him and shove his grin down his esophagus. "You may wonder how we located you," he began. "Of course, it started with that foolish but quite entertaining stunt you pulled, boy. Once we had identified you with the swoop gangs, our agents began asking a few discreet questions." The man stopped then and made a quick gesture at one of the guards, who immediately ducked through the hatch. "It's not a good idea for people in your position to have friends," the man went on. "In war, there are no friends." Gwadge turned toward the hatch, and, almost on cue, the guard returned, dragging someone behind him. "It's not a good idea for people in your position to have friends," the man went on. "In war, there are no friends." Gwadge turned toward the hatch, and, almost on cue, the guard returned, dragging someone behind him. Marek gasped. It was Pargo! He looked awful and seemed barely conscious. The guard threw him roughly to the floor, where he lay groaning softly. There were many small red marks on his face and arms. "Your friend was very stubborn. We had a great deal of trouble restraining him. But we have many ways. Strength alone is so overrated. We took the fight out of him, and he eventually led us to you." His look of self-satisfaction suddenly evaporated. "You should not have killed one of our officers," he said to Marina. "We have a longish ride ahead of us, and I will have time to enact some punishment for that. We do not allow our people to be killed without reprisals. I may not kill you, Madame Stele." Here, strangely, he stared directly into Marek's eyes. "But you may wish I had." There was a commotion behind Marek, the sound of voices arguing. Marek wanted to look around to see what was going on, but he and Gwadge were locked in a silent, staring battle, and neither would give it up. Finally, Gwadge could wait no longer. "What in 1,000 galaxies is going on?" he cried. Marek swiveled his head as far around as he could and caught a glimpse of a woman dressed in the same black uniform as Gwadge. She was talking softly, and Marek couldn't hear what was said. He did notice that the woman was quite attractive, for a Bordali, that is. Gwadge and the woman left, and only one guard remained. Marek listened to the sound of the hatch closing with a soft whoosh. The guard stood uncomfortably eyeing Pargo, who still lay semi-conscious on the deck. "Let's get you into some restraints," the guard muttered, and began to drag Pargo by one arm toward one of the banks of seats. Marek could see the man's eyes clearly from where he sat. He was intent on what he was doing, clearly a little nervous at being left alone with the prisoners. He held a blaster in one hand, dragging Pargo's limp form across the metal deck with the other. A moment later he faltered, as if he had had a sudden thought, or so it seemed to Marek. But immediately the man winced, his eyes grew wide, and he cried out. It was too late. A great hand had closed over his, the one with the blaster, and turned the gun toward the guard's chest. Pargo was awake. There was a short, silent struggle, but Pargo was immensely strong, far stronger than the guard, and within moments had forced the guard to his knees. The blaster remained pointed directly at the guard's chest, and as Marek watched, the man completely lost his will to resist, knowing that to do so would lead to his death. So, instead of Pargo, it was the Bordali guard who found himself restrained. "Don't make any noise," Pargo said quietly as he snapped the restraints on the man's hands, and the guard nodded his assent. "There's a hood over behind those seats," volunteered Marek. "That'll keep him quiet for sure." Pargo glanced over at the discarded hoods, then back at the guard. The man looked terrified. "I don't think so. He won't give me any trouble." "Then get me out of this seat," said Marek. "We've got to find a way out of this mess." "Don't get your hopes up," said Marina. "They've got all the advantages." "We have this," said Pargo, holding the blaster up. "One against many," was Marina's reply, as Pargo set about freeing her and Marek from the restraints. Despite appearances, Marek could see that his friend was struggling to maintain his balance and bravado. Whatever the Bordali trash had done to him, Pargo had not yet fully recovered. A few minutes later, they were standing together facing the forward hatch, wondering what to do, when the ship lurched as if it had hit something. Almost immediately, Gwadge stormed through the hatch, followed closely by the woman in black and another guard. They all carried drawn weapons. Whatever else he was, Gwadge was quick. He immediately sized up the situation, taking in the guard in his restraints and the blaster in Pargo's hand. He also knew that he had the upper hand. "Hold your fire. The situation is about to change very quickly now," he said. "There's an Imperial Star Destroyer off our bow, and we've been caught in a tractor beam. I'm afraid we are no longer masters of our own destiny." He spoke quietly, in a voice laden with resignation. "So, what are you planning to do?" asked Marina in a voice equally resigned. Gwadge laughed, a bitter sound. "What am I to do, my lady? I was going to kill you all out of spite, but now it has been a long war." "Yes, it has," Marina answered. Then, on Gwadge's signal, the 3 Bordali laid down their blasters. Marina nodded at Pargo, who, very reluctantly, followed suit. Then they waited. When the Imperial stormtroopers arrived, anonymous in their white armor, they came quickly, efficiently, through the shuttle's hatch and took up positions with blasters drawn. One of them spoke. His voice was tinny and distant. "Come this way," was all he said. Then the stormtroopers closed ranks around the former enemies. In some way, Marek knew that the war between the Bordali and the Quan, or at least his personal war, was over. He followed the stormtroopers into a waiting assault shuttle, and from there to the Star Destroyer Vengeance. There his life began. 6. The Vengeance. They stood in rows, stretching off into the distance, like great metallic insects on parade. After 3 months, Marek had still not assimilated the vastness of the Star Destroyer, and the sight of all the TIE fighters, bombers, and interceptors in the cavernous hangar still had the capacity to overwhelm and to inspire. And then there were the walkers. He thought often of the irony of his present situation. There they had been, lifelong enemies. Now all that was history. In one moment of destiny, he was made to feel insignificant, and all the causes for which he had stood, likewise. He was afraid. He knew of the Empire, of course, everyone did, but more by reputation and rumor than by contact or experience. The reputation that preceded the Imperials was one of efficient brutality. He saw absolutely no hope of escape and fully expected his life to be a short one. In that he was mistaken, however. When the assault shuttle had taken them to the Star Destroyer, he did not see it. There were no viewports in the small brig where they were held. Stormtroopers watched over them all, and the recent combatants could do no more than stare at each other, looking dull and spent. They knew they had arrived at a new location only by the slight bump as the shuttle docked. They were led at blaster point into a long hallway. They saw little and did not know where they were, if they were on a faraway world, or a ship, or an outpost somewhere. They were separated, and Marek was placed in a cell and left alone. Food was provided after a time. Mostly he waited. Time passed slowly for Marek, and he kept wondering what had happened to his mother and to Pargo. Then an officer came to his cell and spoke with him for a while. He told Marek that the Empire had declared martial law in his solar system, and that all worlds now served the Emperor. "There is peace now among your planets, no more senseless death and destruction," he said. "What do you think about that?" Marek didn't know what he thought. The war was all he had ever known, and yet he hated it bitterly. It had destroyed his world, taken his father, and done nobody any good. He knew both his parents had been against it, and he had been raised to share that view. So he answered, "I think it's a good idea." That seemed a pretty safe answer, considering where he was. The officer nodded. He noted something in a datapad, then asked, "Do you have any skills we would find useful?" "I might, but I want to know about my mother before I answer any more questions." The man made another note. Then he waited. Marek waited too. Finally the officer shrugged his shoulders. "Your mother is fine. You'll see her soon. Now can you answer my question?" Marek realized he had won a minor, if inconsequential, victory. "I am a pretty fair swoop pilot and mechanic. I also have a fair acquaintance with general science and astrophysics," he answered truthfully. "I used to throw a mean hoverball," he added, though he figured it was useless information. The man made more notes, then stood and said, "Thank you." He left. The next day, another officer arrived with a small escort of shipboard troopers. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Pargat and asked Marit to follow him. Happy to leave the confines of his cell and hoping he wasn't going to be shot or otherwise mistreated, he followed. The man led him to smallish amphitheatre that contained perhaps 150 seats arranged before a small raised platform. A few civilians occupied some of the seats, and guards were arranged at intervals against the walls. The civilians were dressed in the same outfit Marek was wearing, white pajama-like pants and shirts with the Imperial logo emblazoned here and there on the fabric, and a large, very readable number on the back of the shirt. Prisoners' clothes. Marek was shown to a seat and told to stay put. He watched as others arrived, and soon recognized several people. Pargo came in, then his mother, the Bordali woman from the shuttle, and he thought he recognized another of the Bordali soldiers. He did not see Gwaj. He recognized public figures from both Kuan and Bordal. Of course, most of the people were total strangers, but many had the look of battle-hardened soldiers. Both his mother and Pargo smiled when they spotted him, but there was an obvious tension about their faces which Marek was sure his echoed. This was no time or place for rejoicing or happy reunions. Who knew what these imperial conquerors were up to? After a time, the amphitheatre was filled. Then a man in a formal imperial uniform approached the raised platform and began to speak. His voice was amplified, though Marek guessed that his natural voice was quiet. "Beings of Tarun, I am Admiral Morden, your host aboard this ship. I have invited you here to introduce you to the Empire, and to help you understand what our purpose is and what your roles may be. You have been chosen from among your people for a variety of reasons. Some of you will return to your home planets and serve the Emperor. Others may, if they qualify, join the Imperial fleet and help us bring order and peace to the galaxy. For now, please listen and learn. Later, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. The origin of the Empire. Do you know why your system has been at war for 20 years? Morden began. Do you know why you have suffered for so long without real leadership, strong economies, and a valued position within the galaxy? Your problems started many years ago with the Republic. Long ago, when the Clone Wars ended, the galaxy was divided up by a group of beings who called themselves senators. These senators formed a government designed to make them more powerful and rich. They were the elite, and all other beings were their unwitting accomplices in the systematic pillage of 1,000 worlds. Of course, the senators made it sound as if they were going to govern fairly, represent their systems, and bring peace and harmony to the galaxy. As you are well aware, they did no such thing. When was the last time Tarun received any aid, commerce, or direction from the so-called Republic? The man hesitated at that moment, and there was a low murmur in the crowd. His words had produced the desired effect. People were grumbling about the Republic, which had never in recent memory paid any attention to the Tarun system. The corruption of the senators gradually came to light, in large part due to the efforts of one of their members, a strong-willed but uncompromising senator named Palpatine. Senator Palpatine worked diligently to expose the corruption and rot, the rampant opportunism that was bleeding the lifeblood of the galaxy. He was one of the few idealists who believed in the rhetoric of the Republic, and who had worked his way to his position through years of service to his fellow beings. Soon, he learned that to expose corruption was both dangerous and ineffective.
His enemies were too well entrenched, so he took a different approach. He worked within the system, gradually making allies of many key members of the Senate, the Republican Guard, and even those Jedi Knights who remained uncorrupted. His great vision was to bring unity and equity to all the worlds, but he quickly saw the weakness of the Republican system. A perceptive student of history, he knew that the greatest strength comes with centralized, individual leadership, backed by a powerful military. This was the vision that he followed, and such was the strength and perseverance of his effort that he was able to form a powerful coalition of leaders who eventually named him emperor. The era of peace and prosperity had begun. However, out in the rim, among the outer planets, events of such importance might not have produced any benefit due to the long neglect of the Republic. It is our mission to bring that unity to the Empire. We carry the force to do so if necessary, but our mission is diplomatic. We will install our sector governors and local authorities, bring order to your worlds, and make them productive members of the Empire. Today, the worlds of the galactic core enjoy prosperity, security, and tremendous growth. With a strong central government, each planet, each system, and each sector contributes its part. The hardy settlers of the Kardua system excel at mining the rich ore deposits of their asteroid belts. Their neighbors in the Zorth system enjoy rich soil and trade largely in agricultural goods. They also provide the finest farberries in the galaxy, prized for their fine scent and invigorating effect. Each benefits from the efforts of the others. Tarun also has a role to play, and we are here to give you the opportunity to join the greatest empire of all time. There are dangers, even to this great empire, to you and to all of us. The Emperor wants you to know who our common enemies are. First, there is the problem of rogue alien races who cannot or will not live in peaceful coexistence and commerce with the human race, or who have designs of conquest themselves, races like the Mon Calamarians and the Wookiee. You can join us in thwarting their destructive efforts. There are also some who wish to resurrect the old corruption. Led by former senators who want to return to their corrupt ways, these rebels have dared to interfere with our attempts to bring peace to the galaxy. Make no mistake, they are led by desperate and persuasive criminals, and they have made unholy alliances with some of the very alien races who desire our destruction. We welcome qualified volunteers in the fight against these evil beings and their lies. The Admiral stopped speaking and looked over the assemblage. Marek felt his eyes sweep over and, very briefly, lock onto his. Or so it seemed. The moment was very fleeting, but it somehow made Marek feel noticed and very uneasy. Then the man continued his speech. He spoke as if he were welcoming them to a hotel or resort, as if he was speaking to paying customers or invited guests. Marek supposed some of the audience might actually have been invited, but many were dressed, like him, in prisoners' clothes. "You are on one of many great ships of the Emperor's fleet," said Morden. "This is the Imperial Star Destroyer Vengeance. Nearby are several other Star Destroyers and a few frigates. We are here to assure you and your neighbors peace, order, and prosperous commerce. Many of you have never seen a Star Destroyer before. I will now acquaint you with this marvelous instrument of peace and order." Then the lights dimmed, and a hollow projection appeared near the man. It showed a great ship, dagger-shaped and ending in a raised wall topped by two cylindrical projections. Though it looked quite complex, there was no scale by which to judge it, and Marek looked on with mild interest. "This is an Imperial-class Star Destroyer," the man announced with obvious pride. "It is an impressive bit of engineering. By way of comparison, I'll show you what a standard interplanetary shuttlecraft would look like in scale. A small shuttle appeared, much like the one the Bordali had used to transport Marek and his mother. It was merely a speck. Marek felt his heart skip. He was inclined to suspect some trickery, but the man went on, as if reading his mind. This is no exaggeration, beings of Tarun. This is accurate. Very few, if any of you, have ever seen anything like it. You are now located on Deck 50 in the mid-octal of the ship. A Star Destroyer contains many thousands of soldiers and crew members. It is essentially a city in space, or a fortress. Each Star Destroyer carries dozens of heavy turbolasers and ion cannons, and a variety of other offensive and defensive armaments. In addition, each carries several squadrons of TIE fighters and TIE bombers, as well as peacekeeping groups of AT-AT and AT Saintwalkers and various other surface vehicles. In addition, each carries several squadrons of TIE fighters and TIE bombers, as well as peacekeeping groups of AT-AT and AT Saintwalkers and various other surface vehicles. Then it suddenly hit Marek like a 10G deceleration. This wasn't a recruitment lecture, as he had thought at first. This was a thinly disguised threat. This Star Destroyer carried enough destructive power to level a relatively small planet like Kuan. If the Empire actually had more than one of these behemoths, it was no wonder they were able so easily to declare themselves masters of a whole system. And that's why so many leaders from both Kuan and Bordal were here. This invitation, being extended to the worlds of Tarun, was offered with a blaster to their heads. They cooperated, or else. But what was Marek doing here? What did they want from him? Meanwhile, the Admiral made a signal to someone, and a holo presentation began. It was a sort of guided tour of the Star Destroyer, making it look more than anything like some well-armed military hotel. Music accompanied the presentation and fitted itself well to the mood of the images being displayed. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer is home to tens of thousands of spaceborne troopers and crew. Here, in the civilian area, you see many beings going about their business. There are shops, services, eating establishments, and leisure centers. As the narrator spoke, the holo showed something that might have been a street in a prosperous city, except that everything was on a somewhat smaller scale. The projection angles had been chosen well to give the impression of a lot of space, but Marek saw that the whole scene showed a fairly small area, at least by planetary standards. Then the scene shifted. The holo showed several images in quick succession. First, there was a small suite, spotless and new-looking. There was a bedroom, living area with communications nook, and a small toilet room. There was no kitchen or apparent eating location. The narration that accompanied the images said this was the typical quarters for the crew. It looked inviting, almost cozy. The music became more heroic, and the holo shifted to an area loaded with equipment and people working. The narrator identified it as a control room, one of many aboard the Star Destroyer. There was a bustle of beings, mostly human, running back and forth from one console to another, looking exceedingly busy and efficient. The Star Destroyer is run by a dedicated crew of skilled technicians. They control the many functions of the ship, including propulsion and navigation parameter input, life support monitoring, shield management, and weapon charging. There are several specialized control rooms as well. For instance, each bank of the Star Destroyer's turbolasers has a separate downstream control area, and there are terminal allocation stations for each hangar to handle and route all traffic to and from the ship. The scene dissolved to show a large room dominated by a raised balcony. The scene depicted a large holomap. Again, there were various soldiers and crew busy at work on various mysterious machines. Tactical operations are handled from the central planning bridge.
Here, the commander and his crew can maintain constant awareness of ongoing operations. The holo presentation continued, showing some of the other sights of the Star Destroyer, including a quick look at one of the huge turbo lasers. Finally, the image faded, the music went silent, and there was a moment of utter stillness within the amphitheater. Then, slowly, the image of a man appeared in the holosphere. He was dressed in a long robe and hood, and Marek felt a resonance within him. Here was a great man of ascetic values and deep thoughts. The man's face was shrouded beneath an oversized hood, so only parts of him could be seen. There was something about him that drew you to him. The man spoke. His voice was soft, yet it pierced the senses. "I am, the Emperor," the man said. He said it simply, with no pretense, but with just a little hesitation to make the idea sink in. This really was the Emperor. Marek, he called Marek by name, he could swear it. "You have been called upon to join us, to join for the good of all beings." It was terrifying. In front of all these people, how could he be addressing Marek? Or was it some trick of the mind? Already Marek was unsure whether he had heard correctly or not, but the hooded being was speaking still, and his voice and inflection rose slowly as he did. "Those who oppose us must be destroyed. Those who would corrupt others, enslave them, and steal what belongs to us all must be stopped. It is time for strength. It is time to remove the last obstacles to peace, prosperity, and real power, such as has not been seen in the galaxy since the days of legend." Marek felt each word the man spoke, as if it were a physical entity. The Emperor spoke for some time, denouncing his enemies and promising to eliminate them. He spoke of loyalty and of peaceful domination over all the worlds. And by the time he had finished speaking, Marek was ready to do anything, go anywhere, to serve him. The Emperor was the only hope for unity and strength. Unity and strength. It became Marek's motto. That was 3 months ago. Now Marek worked as a mechanic in one of the main hangars aboard the Star Destroyer, surrounded by rows of vehicles ranging from TIE fighters to Imperial walkers. He was lacing a new heat panel onto the side of a TIE interceptor that had come in for repairs. They had left Tarun behind and were light years away by now. Marina had stayed on Quan to try to help in the transition of power and to look for her husband. Both Marek and Pargo had joined up, seduced by the excitement and the power of the Empire. Also, though he couldn't explain it, Marek had a strong feeling that his father was no longer in Tarun and hoped to find him somewhere in the vastness of the galaxy. This hangar was a repair and construction facility, and all the vehicles here were either under construction or were damaged and in need of repair. Great burn marks, slashes, and twisted metal confirmed the fact that not all systems were as easily assimilated as Tarun had been. The Vengeance was constantly on the move, making hyperspace jumps from one hotspot to the next. Though Marek had no reason to know about the military missions of the Star Destroyer, there were always rumors and stories filtering down even to his level, and he knew the Vengeance was involved in several actions simultaneously. They would jump into an area of conflict, launch TIE fighters or landing craft, then jump to another area to launch additional ships or to provide support to ongoing operations. Each time they jumped, he could feel a slight displacement or blurring of vision, but it quickly passed. In the past few hours, the Vengeance had made several jumps. Then, perhaps an hour ago, several damaged fighter craft had been brought into the hangar. Marek and the other mechs were working hard to bring them back into service. Earlier there had been several muffled thumps, and someone told Marek it might have been heavy torpedoes hitting the Star Destroyer's shields. It was quiet now, and the TIE interceptor was repaired. Marek asked permission of the foreman to test the interceptor.
It was an unwritten rule that repairs were supposed to perform shakedown tests of the vehicles before handing them back over to ops. Many mechs had learned the basics of piloting, and Marek's swoop experience made him a natural. "We're in planetary orbit over Farboon," the foreman told him. "There's no action out there. Go ahead, but make it quick. We're scheduled for another jump in 3 hours.
Marek climbed into the tie-in and adjusted the seat and belts. He wasn't wearing the standard TIE pilot's helmet and life support gear, but a modified version the repair crew had rigged together. He didn't worry about wearing substandard gear, however. This was the moment he always waited for. Even if it only lasted a few minutes, just long enough to test the fighter's systems, it was like being a bird freed from its cage. He signaled over the comlink that he was ready and fired up the twin iron engines. There was a dull roar inside the cockpit, and the vehicle began to shudder a little. He made a mental note to pass this one over to an engine specialist when he was finished. Then he guided the small craft onto its repressor lifts and toward the airlock. As soon as he blasted out into space, he was greeted by the image of a great planet that dominated the blackness. It was green, blue, and white, and it hovered directly ahead. Marek had never flown near a planet, and he took a moment to enjoy the view. He scanned for any other ships, but saw none. He rolled the fighter to take a quick look at the Star Destroyer. He never got tired of looking at it, could never quite absorb the grandeur and immensity of it. Then he began to run the tie-in through its paces, watching carefully for any signs of malfunction. Normally, repair operated on its own comlink frequency, but Marek had discovered how to tune the link to a dual band that also picked up one of the non-restricted military channels. He liked to listen in on their operations, even though nothing of importance was broadcast over the channels he could hear. Today was different. Just as he was about to head reluctantly for the hangar again, there was a sudden squawk on his headset and an urgent voice came on. "All units, is there anyone operational? Emergency, please report." Marek did not answer. He wasn't supposed to be on this band, after all. But the voice kept calling, and apparently not receiving any answer. Finally, Marek decided to find out what was happening. "This is Stele," he said into the mic. "What's the problem?" "Who the hell are you, Stele? Where are you?" the voice demanded. "I'm in repair, testing a tie-in for return to duty, sir." "We've got a shuttle in trouble," the voice said quickly. He seemed to be listening to someone else speaking at the same time, because his transmission came in bursts of speech separated by short pauses. "No time to argue. Escort destroyed. Too close to planet. Get over to the far side. Find the shuttle." Then he relayed some coordinates and vectors that Marek only vaguely understood, but he fired the engines to full power and headed around the edge of the planet. "We'll be back," was the last thing he heard from the voice. Then he was alone. Looking at his scanners, he saw the Star Destroyer was gone. 8. The shuttle navigation and acquisition of targets in raw space is no easy matter, but within a star system you sometimes get a little help from local sunlight glinting off metal surfaces. So it was that Marek spotted the shuttle and its attackers maneuvering in the lonely blackness above the planet's atmosphere. Soon he could see the blue glow characteristic of ion cannons flickering across the surface of the shuttle's shields. Of course, he had no idea what ion cannon glow looked like, just that it was easily visible. "I see them," he said into the comlink. There was no answer. As he sped closer, he was able to spot 2 Y-wing fighters shooting at the shuttle, which clearly showed Empire markings. There was some debris floating about, and he recognized parts of several TIE fighters. Marek didn't recognize the markings on the attacking Y-wings, but it didn't matter. They were the enemy. Without thought, he rolled into an attack angle that gave him a chance at both Y-wings on the same pass. The tie-in responded smoothly, more smoothly than any swoop ever could, and sped closer to the scene. Marek's hand gripped the controls, and his finger tightened slightly on the stud that would fire the interceptor's weapons. Just then, the nearer of the two Y-wings broke off and began to veer away. He'd been spotted. Marek pressed the stud and saw the momentary glare of laser fire, but only from two of his lasers. He hadn't quad-linked the lasers, and he wasn't sure how to do so. Mechs generally weren't allowed to test weapons. Even so, the dual lasers fired straight and true, and there was a brief glow in the aft section of the Y-wing, a partial hit. But the enemy craft did not slow down, and appeared undamaged. Marek was tempted to follow the Y-wing. It appeared to be moving much slower than his interceptor. The second Y-wing was still attacking the shuttle, however, and Marek altered course slightly to bear directly on it. He began firing as he adjusted his angle, and his first shots went wide. As he closed the gap, he started seeing the telltale glow along the body of the Y-wing. He was hitting the shields. The Y-wing stopped firing at the shuttle and began to move away, but very slowly. He was mesmerized by the sight of his enemy trapped in his sights, and failing to adjust his closing speed, he almost crashed into it. At the last second, he veered off. Then his onboard computer registered that he was being fired upon. As he twisted the tie-in through a hard diagonal loop, he spotted the other Y-wing closing in on him. He had the advantage of speed, but he realized that he couldn't abandon the shuttle while it was still in danger. Fortunately, his swoop training gave him an instinctual feel for combat, and he doubled back on the Y-wing that had shot at him, watched it overshoot the shuttle, and went in behind both Y-wings again. That's when he spotted the first X-wing fighters. They popped out of nowhere several thousand meters off the shuttle's bow. "I'm in big trouble now," he said to nobody in particular. Marek pressed the firing stud, taking a few last shots at the Y-wings, then yanked hard on the controls to pull into a narrow turn. He didn't know if the X-wings were after the shuttle or him. He did figure that he wouldn't have much of a chance against the combined firepower of two Y-wings and two X-wings. If he was to do any good, he'd have to pick his times, so he needed some distance. He headed at full speed away from the crippled shuttlecraft. The two X-wings followed. They were remarkably fast and kept pace with him. They shot at him constantly, but they were just too far away for accuracy. He began to double back toward the shuttle and saw that the Y-wings were returning to the attack. Just then, the Star Destroyer reappeared at minimum safe distance from the planet. If he could just keep the enemy busy for a few more minutes, he was sure that help would arrive. This thought was confirmed when the radio came back to life. "This is V2 X-ray calling tie-in 40V9er. Do you read?" Marek wasn't used to military call signs. "If that's me you're calling, I'm here," he answered. "Get someone here, fast!" "Help is on the way, tie-in 40V9er. Hang in there." He couldn't make the interceptor move faster, and the X-wings were getting closer. It would be a shame to get shot down now, with help so close. He started to corkscrew to throw off their aim. He had seen pilots do it in adventure hollows. His idea was good, but in execution it left something to be desired. He lost control momentarily and found himself spinning and disoriented. Trying to get back on course, he overcompensated and found himself heading directly for the planet. His scanners showed the X-wings still in pursuit, much closer now. Something hit the interceptor. He felt a jolt, like a strong punch in the back. Then the sensors went dead. There was no time for more maneuvering, so he headed into the sludge. He had heard that flying in atmosphere was hard, and that no starfighter pilot liked it, but he knew atmospheric flight, and he was gambling that the X-wing pilots didn't. The tie-in began to shudder and pitch as it hit the wall of gas, and a thick mist immediately obscured his vision. He fought the interceptor, leveling out so as not to dive directly down into the planet's gravity well. His plan was to dip into the upper atmosphere and follow a shallow parabolic vector, re-emerging once again in the vacuum. He hoped this would shake the X-wings. It was like fighting an enraged bantha, and he had no way to know if he was really pulling out of the atmosphere or about to become a fireball on the surface of the planet. He tried to keep his bearings, but without sensors or visual clues, he had to rely on hope and luck. A part of him, calm despite the crisis, realized that he had already pushed luck to the limit. With no formal training, he had just gone up against 4 enemy fighters, and he was still alive. Had he used up all the luck he was allowed? The answer was no. The mist surrounding the interceptor suddenly thinned, and, with a last bone-jarring bump, burst out of the sludge and back into vacuum. There was no sign of the X-Wings. For that matter, there was no sign of the Star Destroyer. "Great," he said to himself. "Now what do I do?" "Head back home, Stele," said a new voice on the comlink. "The excitement's over. Come around on Vector 128 Alpha." "Sorry, sir. Sensors are out, and I'm no navigator," Marek said. There was laughter in his headset. "Just turn right and follow the planet around. You'll find us, or we'll find you." The next few hours were a blur of activity. As soon as he got within range, the Star Destroyer hauled him in with a tractor beam, an ignominious ending to the most exciting adventure of his life. He was beamed into an unfamiliar hangar where a detachment of stormtroopers waited. As soon as he exited the ship, an officer told him to follow and led him from the hangar to a small room nearby. Then the officer and the stormtroopers left him alone in the room. He sat at a small table. There were 2 chairs in the room, and he picked the one that faced the doorway. He waited. And waited. "I am in trouble," he thought. "But what did I do wrong?" He sat for a long time, hours perhaps, before the door irised and emitted 2 stormtroopers in white and black armor. The troopers had their blasters drawn, but Marek's eyes were focused on the man who followed them. He recognized the man immediately. It was Admiral Morden. He looked tired. The Admiral sat stiff and straight in the remaining chair, facing Marek, silent, staring, his eyes blazing blue like an iron furnace. Marek looked down at his hands resting on the table. The knuckles were white. "You were lucky," Morden said. His voice was quiet, just as Marek had suspected it would be, and the medals on the man's chest rose and fell evenly with his breathing. Marek slowly raised his eyes, but could not quite meet Morden's stare. "I know, sir. I hope," Morden interrupted. "You were also very brave." Something skipped inside Marek's chest. That wasn't a reprimand. It was a compliment. Morden continued. "We had secured the area. I was on the way to inspect the planet with a minimal escort when the rebels struck. If you hadn't delayed them—" Marek said nothing. He was too stunned. "I saved the Admiral." "Where did you learn to handle an interceptor like that, son?" Marek snapped out of his daze just in time to catch Morden's question. "In repairs, sir," he choked. Was that going to get him into trouble? But the Admiral raised an eyebrow. Repairs? He seemed to ruminate over the word a moment, as if it had lost its usual meaning. Then he asked, "You like it in repairs, Stele?" "It's all right," Marek replied carefully. "We get to take care of the babies." Again Morden raised an eyebrow. "Babies?" "You know, sir, the pilots. They just hop into the cockpit and fly around in space, while we have to break our hands twisting metal back in place, or burn ourselves on hot sparks from the laser torches." Marek stopped, worried that he had stepped over the line, but Morden just laughed out loud. "Is that what you think a pilot's life is like, son?" Marek said nothing. Suddenly, Morden stood up. "I bet you'd like to be one of the babies, wouldn't you, Mr. Stele?" he asked, leaning over the table and staring down at Marek, who suddenly noticed something under one of his fingernails. "Come see me in 6 months, Morden said as he turned toward the doorway. "Let me know how you're doing." Then he was gone, and Marek was alone again. But not for long. 9. The Imperial Navy. Marek was invited to join the Imperial Navy and told he was going to be trained as a fighter pilot. He had to wait a few days, then, after a jump, he was escorted to an old freighter transport. He spent a short, uncomfortable day aboard the freighter and arrived safely at a planet-side Imperial base. During the whole trip, nobody spoke to him. When he arrived at the base, he received some rations and was told to wait again. After a while, a small detachment of stormtroopers arrived with a pack of young men and women in tow. Then the troopers marched them to another freighter transport, or maybe it was the same one. Marek couldn't tell. When everybody was stowed in, the leader spoke. "You are on your way to Imperial basic training. As of this moment, you are Imperial soldiers, even though you look like scared dinkos and smell worse. You will sit still, keep quiet, and do nothing until you receive further orders." It was a long and quiet trip, shivering in the cargo hold under the watchful eyes of the stormtroopers. They must have looked more like prisoners than elite Imperial recruits. Marek fought off his concerns. He figured that it was all part of the game. No matter how good you were, they had to break you first, then build you up again. It was part of the weeding out process. If you broke too easily, then you wouldn't hold up under the pressures of combat and were a danger to those who depended on you. If you wouldn't break at all, you were too independent and prideful and could never be trusted completely. It was a fine line that every recruit would walk over the next 6 months. The ship lurched out of hyperspace, and everyone slid slightly on the deck as dynamic braking took hold. Suddenly, the stoic figures of the stormtroopers sprang to life, leaping through the huddled cadets, kicking those unlucky enough to be prone and shouting at the top of their lungs. "On your feet, you massive gravel maggots, or you won't live long enough to even begin basic training." Marek was fast enough to avoid a boot slung in his direction and sprang up with a rush of adrenaline in his veins and scanned the room for the next challenge. He didn't have to wait long. As the stormtroopers herded them into some semblance of ranks, the forward airlock of the cargo hold slid open with a menacing hiss. There, with all eyes in the room upon him, stood a man-like form, backlit, dark, and larger than life. He was clad in trooper armor, but the reddish light behind him cast an eerie glow, and an Imperial crest on the right breastplate literally screamed out the man's importance. As troopers moved to flank the man, Marek noticed with some displeasure that the newcomer was more than a head taller than anyone in the room. 2 massive hands reached upward and twisted the helmet release gingerly, belying the ease with which they could just have easily snapped a man's neck. The helmet rose and was tucked casually under a massive left arm. Some unlucky soul behind Marek gasped and received a rifle butt to the side of the knee for the indiscretion. He writhed on the floor now, but had gained enough sense not to cry out. Doubtless others had stifled similar exclamations upon witnessing the scarred visage that glowered at them through one intense eye, its partner a memory behind crudely stitched skin. Marek wanted to look away, but found it difficult. It probably wouldn't have been wise anyway. "I am Senior Master Sergeant Jonna T. Stark," it said, "but you will call me Sergeant or Sir. You have no names other than those I choose to give you. You have no lives other than those I bestow upon you. You have no choice other than to obey. The Emperor is your life. I am his voice. I will find the warriors amongst you and guide them to the glory of the Empire. More importantly, I will find the unworthy. I will hold their hearts in my hand, and I will crush them." And so it began. 10. Basic training. The first day was a marvel of activity, chaos, and eventual order. They were processed, tested, marched, fed, tested some more, divided into groups, and finally assigned quarters. Already several recruits that Marek had noticed in the transport were missing, presumably sent back where they came from. Marek had no idea what his subjective time was, but the base time was late when he was finally able to collapse onto his hard, small bunk in a drafty barracks. Each recruit had been given a small hollow and told, "Absorb this and be ready to regurgitate it tomorrow." And so he sat up, grabbed the hollow, and activated it. 11. Back to the vengeance. Over the next several weeks he was tested, drilled in military procedure, put through basic physical training, and tested again. He had no idea where he was. Nobody ever said, and he learned soon enough not to ask. He learned a lot more as well, and to all outward appearances became a fully indoctrinated soldier of the Empire. He kept his own counsel, however, and endured until the ordeal was over. When his basic training was done, he was picked up again, this time in a troop shuttle, and taken to an outpost on a forlorn-looking asteroid where he spent a few hours in a backwater depot chewing on rations and discussing matters of no importance with the lone agent in charge. He was the only recruit who had been left on that particular outpost. Eventually, another shuttle arrived and took him to rendezvous with the Vengeance, along with a few strangers. In all, he had been away from the Vengeance for a little more than 2 months. Nothing much had changed, except that he was no longer quartered in the civilian area of the ship. "Orders are posted on the holo screen up on the wall," announced the non-com when he debarked the shuttle. Marek read his housing assignment. It was on Deck 3, and the map showed it to be near the main TIE fighter hangar. Pilot's quarters, he thought, with a growing sense of awe and nervousness. He had learned during basic training not to ask questions. This concept did not come easily to him, and several times he had been put on extra duty for opening his mouth. It's not easy to lose a lifelong habit in just a few weeks, but Marek did learn to restrain himself, to bide his time, and to pick his friends and confidants with care. One drawback to his new restraint was that he got thoroughly lost looking for his assigned quarters, where a simple question or two might have gotten him there more quickly. At any rate, he found his way, but not before barging into areas where he was clearly not welcome, where officers and enlisted men looked up from what they were doing and glared. But nobody asked him what he was doing or offered any help, and Marek went on his way as quickly as he could. His new room was a haven of privacy after weeks in the training barracks and an hour or so lost on the massive Star Destroyer. There was a single cot in the room, and he lay down on it as soon as he arrived. Moments later, someone came to the door and signaled. "Come in," Marek said tentatively. It was Pargo. He stood there beaming stupidly, and Marek almost burst out laughing. His friend was decked out in a crisp new naval uniform. He saluted. Marek returned the salute half-heartedly, sick already of the formality of the military life. "What's the big smile for?" he asked.
Pargo walked into the room and leaned against a built-in desk. "Good to see you, too," he said offhandedly. Clearly he was dying to tell Marek something. He looked like the ice creature that had eaten the Tauntaun. "Come on, out with it." Marek didn't much like it when someone stretched out the telling of important news, and, judging by the rictus that passed for Pargo's smile, this was something pretty big. "Are you going to stand there all day, or what?" "Okay, don't get your trainats in a snit. I'm happy for 2 reasons. First, you're back from training and are finally one of us. There's a lot that goes on aboard the Star Destroyer that civilians never know about." "Yeah," said Marek cautiously. "And the other reason?" "I'm going to be a stormtrooper. They asked me to start training in 3 days." Marek wasn't sure why Pargo was so happy. Sure, the stormtroopers were among the most feared and respected of the military divisions, but wearing all that armor and being so nameless and faceless had never appealed much to Marek. On the other hand, "That's great, Pargo. I guess you'll fill out that armor real well. I think I'm going to be trained to be a pilot." Pargo's smile faded. "You mean you're going to fly those rickety TIE fighters?
"Those things are death traps. Are you crazy?" "Guess so," Marek answered. "You heard about my little adventure?" "Yeah," answered Pargo. "I heard. Just like you to hot-dog it like that. You're never satisfied, are you?" Marek laughed. "Some of us have it, some don't." But Pargo was serious again. "You just watch yourself. This isn't a swoop race. You're going to end up in chunks floating through a gas cloud if you aren't careful. Worry about yourself, Pargo. Stormtrooper armor won't stop a direct blaster shot, and knowing you, you'll probably stand in front of a blaster just to find out." "Guess we're both due for a short, fast life," Pargo managed, his lips curling at the corners in a wry smile. "Anyway, gotta go. I've got a duty schedule in a few minutes." Shortly after Pargo left, a message appeared on the small comlink board in Marek's room. It told him to report to pilot training at 0700 hours the next morning. 12. Pilot training. The first day of pilot training consisted of a self-paced holo training session. He reported to the registration desk for pilots aboard the Star Destroyer and gave his name. The guards at the door then let him enter the training flight ops concourse. One of the other pilots, a young man everyone called Brick, joined him inside the concourse. They walked along a narrow catwalk inside a cavernous room. Ahead was a tall elevator column that reached up to the ceiling. Other catwalks curved around and through the space, and various doorways lined the walls on several levels. Marek gawked shamelessly at the spaciousness of the room. He was still having a hard time getting used to the dimensions of the Star Destroyer, and this was yet another reminder of the sheer immensity of the vessel. Brick pointed out the various doorways, each leading to a different area. "First, you've got the training simulator," he said. "Once you've taken some basic instruction, you'll go there to prove you know how to fly a fighter. Then comes the combat chamber. You get to fly simulations of real missions from history. The instructors here set a lot of store on how you do in the historical sims. Actually, it's pretty fun. It's just like the real thing, but you can get blown up and it doesn't matter. Not that you want to get used to being blown up. On the second level, in the back, you get to check the hollows of your battles in the film room. To the left is the tech room, where you can learn all about various spacecraft. The instructors like you to spend some time there too. They claim it might just save your life in combat. Finally, there's the doorway that leads to the ready room and real missions. After your training is done, that's where you'll go. Hey, it's time for your first sim lesson, Cadet Stele. Good luck. Marek entered the combat chamber then, where a great machine opened to allow him inside. Once he was strapped in, the huge machine closed over him like some giant beast devouring him. All was darkness at first. Then, with a mental lurch, he found himself staring out into a starry vacuum. His hand gripped the controls as a sensation of movement and weightlessness overcame him. The simulation was as close to flying as he could imagine, and he quickly gave himself over to the experience. During his first session, Marek learned basic information about the role of a pilot, as well as the systems and controls found on Imperial fighter craft. Much of it was familiar. He had repaired or replaced most of these systems at one time or another. Some of it was new, however, and he absorbed it all eagerly. The sooner he got through this part of the training, the sooner he'd be back behind the controls of a real starfighter. 13. Cockpit Instrumentation Checkout. It was nearly a week before Marek got his first training opportunity inside a trainer TIE bomber. The instructor, a Captain Trox, sat in an extra seat in the specially modified craft and helped Marek become familiar with the instruments and their functions. Of course, Marek had already learned most of this on his own during his stint in repairs, but he kept his mouth shut for the most part. First thing you do, Cadet Stele, is settle into this seat and adjust straps and helmet. Most of our fighter craft lack life support, and this helmet and mask are what will keep you breathing, mister, so don't forget to check it out before you get spaceborne. Marek adjusted the helmet and tasted the slightly stale air that came through the rebreather apparatus. Captain Trox donned his own helmet and spoke through the comlink. His voice was tinny in the speaker, but clear. He walked Marek through the proper pre-launch procedures, and soon robotic arms lifted the trainer TIE bomber and transported it along the hangar rail system to the launch platform. They powered up the twin ion engines and lifted off. Trox piloted the craft at first on auxiliary controls, and soon they were in open space, the Vengeance falling away in the distance. Today you're going to learn about standard cockpit controls. In this trainer craft, all parts of the cockpit are clearly labelled, and I will refer to the labels as I point them out to you. Listen carefully. I don't like to repeat myself, and you don't want to be in a small cockpit with me when I'm in a bad mood. Marek went through the pre-combat procedures several times, making few mistakes. But Trox wasn't satisfied, even when he ran through the procedure perfectly. "Faster," Trox would order. "You're as slow as a space slug. Where do you think you are? Your mama's dinner table? You'll be eating laser fire if you don't move faster than that." 14. Energy management. "That's about all for today, Stepple. You want to take us back in?" "Yes, sir," Marek replied, already beginning to angle the TIE fighter around in a tight turn back toward the Star Destroyer. Marek figured to keep his mouth shut, though he wanted to ask some questions, but Trox, it seemed, was in a talkative mood. "The real key to successful control of your fighter craft is managing energy," he said suddenly. "Do you remember what I told you about the LES displays?" "I do, sir," Marek answered promptly. "All right. I want you to slow this fighter down the most efficient way you can think of." Marek's hand twitched on the throttle controls, and he was about to pull back on the lever. He stopped himself and quickly reasoned out Trox's order. The most efficient way. Marek reached for the button marked F9 and pressed it twice, placing the laser recharge rates at maximum. "Well," came Trox's tinny voice over the speaker, "I'll give you that one, boy. Not many green recruits get that one right. Okay, here's an advance on Lesson 2. If you're as smart as you act, boy, you'll commit these configurations to memory. Make them as automatic as your pre-combat checkout, and you'll have a fighting chance." They were nearing the Star Destroyer, and Trox let Marek perform the necessary communications with landing control. Soon they were tractored into the hangar, and the robotic arms carried them back to the hangar. Marek's initial instructional flight was over, and he had, in the end, actually learned something. 15. Picket duty. Marek's first mission after becoming a bona fide starfighter pilot was a routine assignment at a waypoint. He was temporarily based on a small corvette, nothing as grand as the Star Destroyer. He entered the pilot's ready room for the first time. It was nothing more than a long hallway lined with hanging TIE pilot regalia, the rows of helmets gazing sightlessly into the near distance. It looked like some planet-side trophy case, and Marek had a momentary vision of some giant creature that collected TIE pilots for sport. He shook off the vision and began to search for the suit assigned to him. There was only one other pilot in the ready room. He donned the pilot's outfit with practiced ease, and Marek stopped to observe a moment as the man pulled on the helmet, sealed it carefully to the body of the suit, and then donned his gloves at last. The man turned, as if noticing Marek for the first time. "Easy mission," he stated, his voice thin and nasal through the helmet speaker. "Name's Kadrath. You're the new recruit, Stele?" Marek nodded. Kadrath extended a gloved hand, and Marek returned the gesture. "Better get ready. We launch in just a few minutes. This one here's yours." Kadrath pointed to a suit, indistinguishable from all the others. Marek nodded again. "Thanks," he said, and began putting on the gear. Oversuit first, then boots, helmet, gloves. Kadrath showed him how to inspect everything first, especially the breathing tubes. With no life support aboard a TIE fighter, each pilot has to rely on his suit to protect him from the hard death of the vacuum, he told Marek. "Don't assume anything," he added. Marek followed Kadrath from the ready room to the loading bay. In the corvette, the TIE fighter dock was small, and he quickly found the craft assigned to him. It was an older model TIE fighter, scarred and burned from many battles, and Marek found himself hoping the repair facilities aboard the corvette were well equipped. There wasn't time to inspect the craft, so Marek took a deep breath and climbed aboard, strapping himself in and doing a quick equipment checkout. Then he fired up the engines and allowed the robotic lifters to jockey the small fighter into position over the hatch. A moment later, he was spaceborne and felt the exhilaration of weightless flight. Then Cardath came on the comlink. "Form up with me, Stele. We've got picket duty." It wasn't an uneventful duty, simply flying around and sensor scanning various freighters and transports that jumped into the area.
Then a group of 6 ordinary freighters arrived, and Marek fired up his engines, nosing his starfighter over in their direction. He used his target locator to select the first of the freighters and headed directly at it. Flying close to the freighter, his scanners revealed that it was carrying legal cargo, food supplies. Bound for some far-off world, he thought. He used the target locator and turned toward the second freighter. Everything remained routine until he reached the 5th freighter. "Weapons," he called into the comlink. "I've got a load of weapons here." "Good work, Stele," came the answering message. "Help is on the way." Just then, the onboard computer registered that several new shuttles had appeared out of hyperspace. These new shuttles did not identify themselves, which was enough evidence of their unlawful intent. Marek found the nearest one on the target locator and jerked his TIE fighter over in a hard turn. He came quickly upon the transport, and a visual sighting showed the hated symbol of the Rebel Alliance on its dorsal fin. The Rebel shuttle was slow, however, and after increasing laser recharge rates to maximum, Marek still was forced to lower engine power to 2-3. He opened fire without delay, staying easily on the shuttle's tail. When he came close enough, the target identification system confirmed the shuttle's identity. He watched the indicator between shots to see how much damage the enemy had sustained. While he was so engaged, other TIE fighters arrived, and there was a confusion of laser blasts from the opposing spacecraft. "Come on," he urged. He was speaking to his dual-firing lasers, which made extremely slow work of destroying the shuttle. He was anxious to help the other pilots, but the shuttle's shields were strong, and even with supercharged blasts, they held out a long time. Suddenly, the shuttle ahead turned sharply to the right. Another enemy shuttle appeared from behind it, boring directly down on Marek's unshielded TIE fighter. His threat indicator lit up, and he jerked off course in a sharp turn, thinking to avoid enemy fire. But he hadn't counted on friendly fire, and he almost ran directly into the beam of an oncoming TIE fighter who had joined in the pursuit. Only a last-minute juke saved him. He quickly found the shuttle he had been chasing and attached himself to its tail once again. But his hand on the stick was shaking, and he could feel the perspiration dripping down his face inside the confines of his helmet. His breathing, too, was ragged. How easy it would be to die in one of these space buggies. Pargo had been right. In the end, Marek survived. He shot down 3 rebel shuttles as they arrived in successive waves. Only 2 TIE fighters were lost in the battle, and the rebels were routed. The squadron commander congratulated the survivors and held a short ceremony for the dead. Marek retired to his temporary quarters after the ceremony and sat for an hour with his head in his hands. He had watched one of the Imperial pilots die. His TIE fighter had collided with a rebel ship and disintegrated. The rebel ship's shields took a beating, but the shuttle was not destroyed. It was a sobering moment. Marek realized that the only way to survive as an Imperial pilot was to fly the better craft. There was only one way to get that opportunity. He had to be the best pilot in his squadron. He had to earn the right to be counted among the elite, because only the elite had any hope of surviving for long.
At that moment, Marak's vision appeared before him. He saw it as a tunnel stretching off into the future. At the end, a bright light awaited him. Was it an early and explosive death, or would he become a star among the imperial elite? He pondered the question until he fell asleep. In his dreams, he heard the Emperor's voice. "Marek, you have been called upon to join us, to join for the good of all beings. You are mine." 16. Epilogue. Marek watched the Admiral step off his personal shuttle and begin to walk toward the hangar exit. He stepped slowly, apparently deep in thought. After a moment, he stopped and looked around. His eyes scanned the room, fixed on Marek, and for an instant there was no recognition, but that quickly passed. "Stele!" he called. "Sir?" the young pilot answered, walking up to Admiral Morden and offering a formal salute, right hand to left breast. The Admiral raved off the salute and smiled. "You've had a taste of the pilot's life. Does it suit you?" "Sir, I believe it does, sir." Morden laughed. "You've become quite the proper pilot, Stele, but can you still think for yourself? Let me tell you, this galaxy is unkind to those who do not keep their wits about them, and I fear we will see things turned inside out before long." Of course, Marek had no idea what the Admiral was talking about. "How so?" he asked. "Ah, young Stele, I smell treachery and deceit. I've survived long in this job because I sense such things, just as I sense loyalty and dedication and promise. Take my word for it, not all is as it seems." The Admiral seemed to be in a talkative mood, though to Marek's ear it sounded a little like the musings of a man with something else on his mind. But the Admiral wasn't finished yet. "Distinguish yourself in your missions, and you too will come to see the pattern of events. Pay attention to all around you, and perhaps, just perhaps, you may command a starship yourself someday." "Yes, sir," Marek answered, "but what must I do in the meantime?" "A good question, pilot. Survive, destroy the enemy, follow orders, fly your tours, win your citations, and keep your eyes and ears open and your mouth shut. Most of all, stay alive. That's critical." This struck the Admiral as exceptionally funny for some reason, and he burst out laughing. "Stella, I find you amusing. Come see me any time. My door is always open." Use this password with the orderly. Say, "There's a fog over Celadon City, and he'll let you in. Goodbye for now, Startle." The Admiral turned to walk away, and Marek heard him still chuckling as he left. Marek resumed his duties and tried not to think about Morden.